What's up, everybody? Welcome back to The Elevator Life. Today we have a pretty exciting episode because we're featuring someone in a business field we've never hosted on this show before, and this is our good friend, our legal counsel, Khris. So Khris, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Want to give a quick introduction?
Sure thing. Hey guys, my name is Khris. I'm a California licensed attorney currently living and working in Guangzhou, China. And I've been here for about 6 months now.
Yep, so as you can see, he's pretty green to Guangzhou, pretty green to China. So I thought it'd be very cool to get his perspective on China coming as in such a serious profession, but coming to such a developing market. So, of course, you know, it's been about 6 months. How do you feel about life here? How do you feel about the adjustments, the pros, the cons?
You know, so far I don't really have any complaints. It's been very easy for me to transition and settle in. I think I've benefited from the fact that I've lived abroad several times before, so I've had a lot of exposure to international markets, new cultures, and trying to adapt to a new lifestyle.
Great.
That being said, China is very, very welcoming. I don't know what the experience of some of your viewers might be back home or what their expectations are, but I found it to be a very open, receptive culture. Kind of feel like a rock star here sometimes, actually. You're
the big, tall...
Stand out, they think you're famous.
Yeah, so. Get a few photos taken with you and everything.
More than a few,
all
absolutely.
The time. That's good. Yeah, that's always a good thing. Boost the ego, right? So as you can see, a pretty smooth transition for you, which is nice. You made a great point about the people being very welcoming. Do you have any, I guess, cons or anything negative or something you had to get used to adjusting here? Or has it been, pretty smooth overall?
There are naturally always some sort of difficulties that you run into in a new environment. For me, I think the most difficult thing was adjusting to banking culture here. The first time I went to a bank and stood in line for 2 hours to make a simple deposit was mind-boggling because there was nobody in line in front of me. So it's just those little things that sometimes take a little getting used to.
Absolutely, they do things. It's just the China lifestyle, the China, the way it is.
This is China.
You have to get used to it, or else you got to leave. Well, that's great. So obviously, lifestyle's good here. And what is your, I guess, perspective, being in the legal realm, from a business point of view, I guess? Like, do you see a lot of new entrepreneurs, or a lot of new businesses incorporating here? Or, overall, what's your business feel for the city? Is it pretty good? Or China as a whole, if you will?
Absolutely. So historically, Guangzhou and Guangdong province were the manufacturing hub of China. They still are. At one point, 97% of all exports actually filtered through and out of Canton province.
97?
97%.
What's up,
That number
Canton?
is still very, very high. I don't know the exact statistics, though, for your viewership. That being said, there's still a lot of manufacturing that goes on in Guangdong, particularly out in Dongguan, as you probably are well aware.
Yeah.
What I've seen, though, in my own work is that a lot of the foreign direct investment that's coming in is now starting to venture into the interior of China. Traditionally, it was Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou that got the brunt of any foreign investment. Now we're seeing that market expand into the interior as new markets open up. As logistics and supply improves, people are able to get their goods and services into the interior, and there's a completely untapped market there for a lot of different industries.
We've talked about
lots of potential.
Yeah, we've talked about that a lot here on the Elevator Life. The second tier and third tier city development, and not the non-coastal provinces or cities. So right now, you can say that there's a ton of capital flowing into those regions. That's very, very exciting. So see. Not just us, Khris thinks so as well. There's a lot going on in those second and third tier cities, but of course life there may not be the best if you're trying to just make the smooth transition, right?
True. There's obviously a little more difficulty when you're moving to a more remote area of town. It might not have the same services or infrastructure that particularly Westerners and expats are accustomed to. That being said, cost of living is also less, so your salary carries a lot farther than it would living in some place like Shanghai where rent is exorbitantly high.
Yeah, very, very true.
So sometimes you can make it into the lifestyle that you want, that you're comfortable with.
Yeah, so maybe if you live in a smaller second tier city, you can raise your quality of life. Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. So we've got that kind of perspective on life, on business, but now to the stuff I'm sure a lot of people want to hear about, the legal red tape. Everybody knows China is famous and very well known for how strict their regulations are for importing, for exporting, for incorporating. Can you shed a little bit of light on that from your perspective, what you've seen?
I'd be happy to. There are a number of different areas, obviously, that this bureaucratic red tape sort of spills over into. As you mentioned, import regulations are pretty stringent, and in particular VAT assessments, VAT taxes are very high. Some people who get into the manufacturing side of imports, exports don't necessarily realize that until it's too late and they're at the customs doorstep going, why am I paying all these fees? There are some great resources available that will give you a little bit more of a breakdown in terms of what you can expect when you reach the door of customs. But there are a number of hurdles to jump through, so it's always very beneficial if you use a well-known licensed importer or exporter to handle your good shipments. That's one aspect. From a legal standpoint, a lot of what we see, particularly with litigation and arbitration in China, is that it's what some people would call actually a descending trajectory. I know that's what my managing partner always refers to it as. And the reason is China has very much expanded their legal capabilities over the last 20, 30 years. They went from basically 2 laws on the books to volumes and volumes of legal regulation now. And it's just a process where it takes time for judges and attorneys to get up to speed on all those legal regulations. They're promulgating so many new laws on a daily basis that it's virtually impossible to keep on top of it. That's one aspect. The other issue is, for a long time, you had judges that weren't well trained. Until recently, there was actually no requirement that you even go to law school to be a judge.
In China?
In China.
Knowledge bar.
So, yeah,
really?
knowledge bar indeed.
Wow.
So you had attorneys who were oftentimes more qualified than the judges that were handling the cases, and that, of course, created problems and inconsistencies.
You don't say.
And so they're tackling a lot of those issues, and they're certainly making steps in the right direction.
That's great to hear.
But as with everything, it takes time.
It takes a lot of time, and I know all about those hurdles he talks about for importing and exporting. Those are not small ones. You have to jump through so many hoops. I mean, the stamps, the signatures, the filing, the paperwork, and it's just, yeah, we always talk about it, it's a headache, but I mean, the consensus, like it's improving. They're trying to make improvements.
They are definitely trying to make improvements. And actually one area that China's increasingly becoming more and more key players within intellectual property, their IPR rights and their IPR litigation is actually one of the best aspects to the legal system that we've seen. And what I mean by that is, increasingly you see IP litigation being handled in an efficient and predictable fashion, which is what we would anticipate for a growing economy like this. And in addition, IP registrations now, outpace the US. So more and more people are recognizing the importance of registering their intellectual property here, getting the proper procedural safeguards in place, and really taking advantage of a system that can provide a lot of good benefits for business people.
Of course, and something I want to talk about as we're talking about people coming to China with their products and making sure they're copyrighted and protected. So a lot of people, contracts in China, they say, well, they don't really mean anything. But you can go through the proper channels, perhaps, I mean, obviously the contract has to be in Chinese, et cetera, has to be registered here. But there are ways to protect yourself, even if you're overseas and you see your product or whatever your business, et cetera, are being violated in China.
Absolutely.
Okay.
As you mentioned, yes, a proper contract is always the first line of defense. I think some of it boils down to actually cultural expectations and differences. For instance, memorandums of understanding are fairly common throughout Chinese business practice. And from a stateside perspective, we look at an MOU and go, doesn't really matter, not a big deal. Whereas for a lot of Chinese businesses, the MOU is a very important aspect to the initial stage of negotiations. And sometimes they actually see it as more of a contractual obligation.
Oh, interesting.
So for a Western company coming in, they might say, oh, well, we're just negotiating business terms. Whereas the Chinese manufacturer thinks of it as, no, we're negotiating the contract, and this is what we're going to base our relationship on at a later date. Additionally, yes, you want the document to be in ideally English and Chinese, or whatever your foreign language is. The reason for that being, if the contract's being negotiated only in Chinese and written in Chinese, and if you don't speak Chinese, then you have no idea what it really says. So it's important to be able to adequately understand the contract that you're entering and make sure that you can protect your interests.
Absolutely.
And although the Chinese courts, yes, will recognize a Chinese language agreement, you can actually phrase it so that both language versions are of equal validity. So if there's ever an issue where you're not sure which document controls or what it really says, they can both be of legal effect.
Interesting, because I've seen a lot of contracts in China. In the end, if there's ever a contractual dispute, the Chinese contract always, always is taken as the final contract.
Correct.
So that's great. That's very cool to see. No, I didn't know that actually. That's great.
The other thing actually that you can do for a lot of contracts now, arbitration is a very, very common procedure. And so more and more contracts increasingly contain an arbitration provision. With that, you don't even have to go to arbitration in China. You could elect to go to arbitration in, let's say, Hong Kong, where maybe they speak English if you want to do arbitration in a foreign language, or maybe someplace where the rules are a little more simplified. Obviously, CTAC is the big arbitral body in China, but that's had some of its own issues lately. With some political infighting and some of the directors being, in prison. So,
in prison.
Sometimes there are alternatives that are just as effective.
Of course.
Close by.
Great. Well, great. So obviously, the legal realm in China is improving. It sounds like there's good ways to protect yourself, even though all the horror stories you hear are probably the people who are just not very well prepared to enter the market correctly. And lastly, what I want to talk about is something Khris is doing right now, what he's building, and he's building something very revolutionary for the online world and international law. So if you want to give a little introduction to that, I'm very happy to have him on here and talk about it, because this should be a lot of help for all the people who are watching this, doing business, thinking about doing business, and anywhere in the world.
Thanks. So basically what I decided to start up about a month ago is a new site called novuslegal.com, novuslegal.com. And the purpose of Novus Legal is to be sort of a video blog or web series that talks about all of the challenges inherent in trying to navigate a complex international business landscape. It'll provide insight into some of the common pitfalls, as well as useful advice on how you can protect yourself and your business when operating in an international environment, not just in China, but around the world. So it'll sort of follow the progression of starting a business, initial non-disclosure agreements, business entity formation, and all the things that you might consider along the way.
Yeah, wow. So we'll throw the link on to that at the bottom of this episode. But obviously, if we didn't have Khris here, we would be using his site, and I think it's going to be a great resource. As you said, it's a new idea, don't really exist right now on the big world of the internet. So I think it's going to do really well, and best of luck on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so everybody, again, this is Khris. Thanks very much for coming to this episode.
Thanks for having me.
Hope you learned something well, and go check out Novus Legal and let us know what you think. All right, cheers everyone.